First of all, thanks for the invitation, and thanks for the great work being done by the people in this room. As His Royal Highness said this morning, you are the people who we depend on, the scientists, for us to make in the end, the right decisions. I'd like to begin, because 10 minutes is a short time, by what I've got here in front of me, which is one of my favorite poems. And it's Pablo Neruda, the Chilean Nobel laureate. And he wrote a poem called The Sea, and I'll just read you the first verse. I need the sea because it teaches me. I don't know if I learn music or awareness, if it's a single wave or its vast existence, or only its harsh voice, or its shining suggestions of fishes and ships. The fact is that until I fall asleep, in some magnetic way, I move in the university of the waves. And for me, that really resonates. I'm a fifth generation Fijian. I've been brought up alongside, in, under, over the ocean. And the lessons that the sea taught me from that early age, what really has shaped my life. First of all, of course, the beauty of the ocean and the wonder of being a human being on this planet. To be able to just walk off our beaches and straight into that incredible wonderland of the coral reefs and snorkel through that was just, I suppose, if you lived on the Serengeti Plains, you would have a similar sort of childhood memory. But for me, that has always been my faith in the wonder of life. It was what the ocean taught me as a young man. It also taught me as I grew up and spent most of the first 3/4 of my life working in Fiji. It taught me about the harshness of life, the difficulties of life. And those lovely photos that Ian showed you, I noted the sea always looked pretty placid in all of them. But if you're down in the sort of 18 degrees south where we are in Fiji, you go to sea, and if you haven't got your sea legs, you're going to be throwing up for most of the day. Being at sea is tough. It's why I guess our ancestors made it onto land. Many of people that my wife and I know lost their lives at sea. The reefs, wonderful, beautiful biodiversities of bunkers of biodiversity, but there are also things that ships run into in the night, and that tends to take away your life when that happens. Diving, we were all divers. We know lots of people who've been swept out to sea in currents through the swift passage through those reefs. So there's harsh lessons to learn from what it means to live on planet Earth as well, from the ocean. But as one got older, and especially when I got to the United Nations earlier this decade, you start learning the lessons from the ocean about what humanity is doing to this planet, and the fact that since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution through to where we are now, we have been filling up the atmosphere with GHG emissions, which are now changing the fundament of this planet, the fundament in which life has developed, and in particular our species has developed. So there are very important lessons to learn from the sea there. And I think I don't want to spend too much time on listing them, because my main point really is that, as His Royal Highness said, we are now aware. And quite frankly, if we're not aware now about the damage that's being doing to the ocean, we're never going to be aware. So for those of us that are aware, and as I said to Ian, I think it's probably about a 50% thing around the world. I speak in 2 different capitals every week of the year on this subject. The people that make the decisions are aware now that the ocean is in trouble and that we need ocean action, just as we're getting climate action because of climate change, because of ocean action. Because of ocean change, we're now getting ocean action. You can see that in governments, you can see that in organizations. So the awareness factor is there, but you know what the problems are, the deoxygenation, and what that will do to productivity of the ocean, to life in the ocean. Acidification, and again, what that will do for ocean calcifying organisms. About warming, all of these as a result of climate change, of course. CO2 levels in the atmosphere in particular. The warming, what that's going to do to species migration, indeed to deoxygenation, coral die-off, to sea level rise. And sea level rise, I'll say a little bit more about that. It's going to affect all of us, not just remote Pacific islands. And then, of course, we've got all those human activities, pollution, unconscionable levels of plastic in the marine environment, all the problems of solid waste and chemicals from industry and from agriculture that are flowing in from the rivers of the world into the ocean. And then, of course, man's overfishing and harmful fishing practices, which are carrying on around the world, in which we're fighting against these harmful fishing practices, including fisheries subsidies at the WTO. So, we're seeing that all that negativity of the coral die-offs, the proliferation of dead zones, over 400 now identified around the world of dead areas of the ocean, and the decline of fish stocks. I was recently launching the SOFIA at the FAO in Rome, the biannual statement of the state of fish stocks. And we know that over some 60% are being fished absolutely to their maximum limit, and that some 30% are being overfished, i.e. are on the path to extinction if we carry on. We can see the way that tourism industries are having to react to pollution of beaches and the ocean itself. In fact, this will be a main topic for my work in Southeast Asia over the next year, starting with the Bali Our Ocean Conference later this year. And, we can see it in our degraded foreshores and ecosystems and the loss of biodiversity. But as I said, I don't want to dwell on the negative. The positive is where we've got to go on all this. I'm a grandfather, and like His Royal Highness, that is why I'm doing what I'm doing, which is in the days left to me to try and leave this ocean, in this case, in a state that my grandchildren will be able to witness some of that joy that I talked about being born in Fiji, of seeing the ocean and the reefs. So let us move from that campaign of raising global awareness. And it's been a long campaign. We probably started seriously in the early 2000s, but I think it was really over the last 5 years that we really started to make a difference. Let's move from that stage of trying to raise global awareness and move to the next stage, which is about the solutions and the strategies to implement those solutions. So we had the first Ocean Conference in June 2017. Some of you were at that. And that was to make sure that Sustainable Development Goal 14, the ocean goal, was being faithfully implemented. We had that, as I say, to raise that global awareness. The move now is to have a second UN Ocean Conference, first half of 2020, so it's not very far away, in Lisbon. The UN is now working on the mandating of that conference. The governments of Kenya and Portugal have offered to host it. And there's a reason for that conference, which is that SDG 14, which, as I said, the ocean goal, is the universal thing that we have as humanity. It was agreed to by all our political leaders in September 2015 at the United Nations, adopted. And if you see the 10 targets of SDG 14, which pretty comprehensively cover the ocean action that I said we need, if you look at those 10 targets, you'll see that 4 of them mature in 2020. So to be honest with ourselves in the process, we've got to have that moment of assessment in 2020. And the 4 targets themselves, of course, are very interesting and relate very much to what you're discussing today with BIOT, which is that one of the targets is that 10% of the ocean will be covered by marine protected areas by 2020. We're currently at about 7%. So there's work to be done there. I want to also, as well as mentioning that that conference, I want to mention the Paris Agreement, because as I said, as a grandfather and concerned about my grandchildren's place on this planet, I think there are 2 things which I can do to help them. One is to see that the SDG 14 is being implemented, indeed all of the Sustainable Development Goals, and secondly, that the Paris Climate Agreement is being faithfully implemented. And it was because of that that Fiji, we took up the presidency of the what's called COP23, the climate process. and Fiji is currently doing that. So our Prime Minister is going around the world trying to raise ambition on that, particularly for the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. And in fact, I'm flying to San Francisco in the morning to join him at the Global Climate Summit, which Governor Brown of California has organized with Mayor Bloomberg. So we have to tie the Paris Climate Agreement to everything we're doing in terms of the survival of our species, because without those lifting ambitions of nationally determined contributions under that agreement, it's not going to look good, because we're still climbing towards over 3 degrees when we should be heading for 1.5 degrees or under 2 degrees at least. But we're still on track for over 3 degrees. And that is just catastrophic, really, for conditions on this planet. So never forget that the Paris Climate Agreement is the key to all of this. And indeed, as His Royal Highness mentioned, the preparation for the UN Decade on Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. This was something that was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in December last year, and will in fact be led by the IOC UNESCO in Paris, with who I work very closely. And that decade is going to be a giant leap forward for science, but also for all of us. And I'm sure is going to lead to such, I mentioned sea level rise. I'm getting the signal from my wife here, to such things as addressing sea level rise. We have to be told by science how high those sea levels are going to rise. I'm on the board of one of the world's leading oceanographic institutes, and we were recently deciding on the jetty, how high we're going to build our next jetty. It was a $40 million decision. And we had the best science available to us to say how high the seas were going to go in that particular bay. $40 million decision. That's just one jetty in one small bay. You put that down the whole east coast of the United States, and then to coasts around the world, which are being affected, will be affected over the next 50 to 100 years by sea level rise. And you're talking trillions of dollars of infrastructure investment. And I don't think the world has quite taken that on board. Look, I had some other shout-outs to make, but I'll wind up here. I started with a bit of poetry, and since I'm in the UK, I'll end with a bit of Shakespeare, if I may. Here we go. There's a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood leads on to fortune. Omitted, all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries. On such a full sea are we now afloat. We must take the current when it serves or lose our ventures. So I sincerely believe that we are on that full sea because we have that awareness now. We have the science, we have the resources to deal with ocean action. So we are on that full sea. We're assembling our solutions. We're moving now into, as I say, the strategies, charting our course for the voyage ahead. And as we say in Fiji, and it's been our theme this year while we've been the COP president for climate change, we're all in this canoe together. And to conclude, I'd like to, having mentioned Shakespeare, I'd like to mention some other brave true words, which are from Nelson Mandela, who said that everything is impossible until we do it. Thank you.